anyway, that's what happened. And then I pointed at my feet, and they had a bunch of stuff that they'd collected that fell out of planes and dropped and whatnot. They took my escape kit away from me and whatever else I had. And there was two big old boots, felt boots. You know, they used to put them on top of your GI shoes. Some enlisted men still wore those things. And there was a pair of them. And I pointed my feet, and that Burgermeister gave them to me, and I put them on. But they were, oh God, they were about 2 sizes too big, and my feet sloshed around in them. Later on, up at Oberusel, I took some of the Excelsior out of the mattress and filled them up so they wouldn't be so sloppy. But they happened to be full of fleas, and they bit all around my ankles. But that's a story about that. Then they marched me up the street to the church, and they put me in this little jailhouse underneath the church tower. I was the first one captured, like I said, around there, and they put me in there, and I was alone. They locked the door, and all I was a little shaft of light coming through a small window, and that was it. Room probably about twice as big as this little room here. Maybe even a little bit bigger, not much bigger. With straw on the floor on stones. And didn't do anything, but I just sat there with my thoughts, you know, trying to figure out what's going to happen next. And that's when they threw Sergeant Epley in, who was our top gunner. Sergeant Epley, he told me he saw the planes coming in, and he started shooting at them with a top turret. And he watched those tracers coming right up the fuselage of the plane right towards his turret. And he didn't get wounded, but he didn't hear the bailout bell. And he's still in the turret when he saw the co-pilot go by, and then the pilot, so he dropped right down behind him. He came right down behind the pilot. And they got down into the bomb bay, and they're all supposed to, off the flight deck, go out of the bomb bay. Well, evidently the radio man had already gone up towards the nose with the tunnel. Oh, and when he got there, the other two guys are going up the nose. So he reached out automatically, and he pulled the handle on the bomb bay doors, and they opened. The only thing he can think of is that they pushed her instead of pull her, or vice versa. And they didn't open, so they thought it was jammed. They were going up to the nose. And I think that's what killed the pilot, because when he bailed out, he said it blew shortly afterwards. And the pilot must not have got out.
Well, the pilot died in the plane?
Yeah. At least his body was thrown right near the wreck. See, if the co-pilot, the radio man, the co-pilot, and the pilot had all gone out the bomb bay door, they would be alive today. But evidently, for some reason, they thought the bomb bay, maybe they pulled the handle the wrong way.
The bomb bay door
it might even have been stuck a little bit, but this guy, when he pulled it, it opened. And he went out, and as soon as he went out, it blew. And he thinks the co-pilot got out, and the radio man got out, but they were both wounded. The co-pilot had a broken leg. The pilot, Jim Shane, I don't think ever got out of the plane. Now, the tail gunner and the two waist gunners were both killed, too. Now, whether they were killed in the battle or blew up in the plane, we'll never know. The tail gunner was Parsons. Two waist gunners were, one of them was Johnson, and the other was Brian. Wait a minute, let me find it. So, Shane, here we are. Now, in this list here, it lists Parsons as a waist gunner, but actually he was flying tail gun. And Johnson was a waist gunner, and Brian Hurt is listed as a tail gunner. I think he was flying as a waist gunner. Hurt was from Florida. McDowell, he's still alive, I guess. Bean's still alive. Epley, I don't know about him.
You and Epley, and there was one other one now?
Well, there was a guy by the name of, I think his name was Summers.
Summers, okay.
But they can't find any evidence there was a guy named Summers on the mission. So I may be wrong. In the next few minutes, they open the door. Every time you turn around, they're opening the door, throwing another guy in there. So, honest to gosh, we must have had 14 guys in there, in that room. One of them was Red Dowling. I remember Red was hurt, and he was also sick because he threw up in the corner. That's one reason I remembered him. And his violent red hair. I don't know how I knew his name was Dowling, but I did, unless somebody else called him that. But when I first wrote to him years later, I said, I think you're the red-headed guy that was in that little cell with me. And he said, I'm the red-headed guy. Pretty soon they opened the door and they told us to rouse. We all stood up in a line outside the door there. And they came down the line, they picked 3 of us out. They picked me and Epley and this guy, I thought his name was Summers. I know he was a lieutenant. And he said he was a navigator. But anyway, us 3 fellas. And the rest of them, they loaded them on the Vermont truck and away they went. Never saw them again. They took us 3 guys and they marched us down to the street. And up the street came 2 hay wagons. They had hay piled on, not high, but the bed had about that much hay in it. Each wagon was drawn by a team of horses. And there were a whole bunch of men and boys. They were either older men or younger boys. And they all were more or less armed to some extent. There was one little guy, he was an older guy, but he was short. His name was Hans, had black hair. And he had an old Mauser pistol in a wooden holster. You've seen them. The wooden holster serves as a shoulder piece. It's a World War I Mauser, you know. Got a big broom handle on it. Looks like it's a turn handle. He had one of those, and there was an aristocratic-looking guy on a horse. Looked like a gentleman, and he had a fine shotgun. And he was riding around through the hills and fields, and he'd come back and report where there were dead people, or where there were bodies, or where there were wrecks. None of these people were military. They're all civilians. So we marched up the street. I still had no idea what they were going to do with us. We're marching alongside the wagon, and when we got up to, looked like a little orchard, the fence around it, went through the fence, and lying there on the ground, face down, was one of our flyers with no chute. He came down without a chute. And oh boy. Then I found out what they wanted us for. We had to pick the bodies up. So when we picked him up, he was still warm, and he was, every bone in his body was broken. He was limp like. And the one German guy there had an envelope, and we took one dog tag off, and that guy put it in this envelope, which they sent to the Red Cross, obviously. And I remember reading that guy's dog tag, and his name was Bateman, and he turned out to be a navigator on Johnson's crew, which Dowling was the bombardier on. So we picked him up, put him in the wagon, hay wagon. Then we marched around up and down the hills and fields all day long till almost dark. And we picked up a dozen or more bodies and parts of bodies. We went in one little cow pasture, and we found 2 legs sheared off right here. And this guy must have been big because his thigh was big and heavy. And he still had his flying boots on. And it was an officer because he had forest green pants on. We picked those legs up and brought them in. We came across, went up in the hill one time, and we found this plane crashed up there, and there was a turret, looked like a turret. It sheared right off of the thing some way, and there was a guy in there, and the top of his head was sheared right off. You could see his brains in there. And we found another guy that came down in his chute, and he must have been killed in the fall. He was lying, his feet was in a kind of a little creek. He was dead. We came across a meadow, and there was a guy laying in a pool of blood, and it turned out to be Joe Guilfoyle. He was tossed out with a static line after he got hit in the leg by a 20 millimeter by those guys on Miner's crew. And it happened that Guilfoyle had been on the Shane's plane before, and Epley was a good friend of his. When we rolled him over and he saw who it was, he almost passed out. You know, it hit him hard, Epley. And I remember Guilfoyle's skin it was drained of blood. He was kind of a bluish pale color, no blood left in him. It was all blood all over the meadow. Oh, that morning in the mess hall, I'd seen a guy. I'd seen him before, and I never knew who he was. He was in a different squadron, but kind of a big, rough-faced looking guy. And who the hell is that guy? Something about him. I don't know why I noticed him. So we came across this plane that's crashed, and in the co-pilot's seat, here's a guy sheared in 2. From here down is in the co-pilot's seat. The rest of them is missing. We look up ahead, and up about 100 yards ahead, here's a upper part of his torso butted into a tree. He must have been in the plane when they hit, and it just sheared him in 2. So when I rolled him over, My God, it was a guy I'd seen in the mess hall that morning. And I paid particular attention to his name. His name was Geisler. Martin Geisler Jr. Martin Geisler Jr.
Co-pilot.
Everybody on that plane was killed with the exception of the pilot, and the pilot's now dead. But I have a little article he wrote one time, and he said that after they got hit, he must have been blown out or something because he don't remember a thing until he came to in the hospital. Well, anyway, I'm going to tell you about this Geisler. When I was in College Group 1, it happened there was a fellow from Los Angeles by the name of Oscar McMahon in the same room I was. And after the war, this Geisler was from Bell, California, which is in the Los Angeles area. And after the war, I got a phone call one day. I got home. It must have been the summer of 45, and I got a phone call, long distance from Bell, California. And it was Mr. Geisler, this guy's dad. I want to know who I was, if I was the same guy that was on the Kassel mission. I said, yeah. He said, we were at a Red Cross meeting, and we met a fellow named Lieutenant McMahon, and we asked if anybody knew of anybody that was on the Kassel mission. He said, yeah, I knew a fellow was in prison with me, and he gave my name and address, so they called me. And he said, my son, Martin Geisler Jr., is missing, and we don't know what happened to him, and everything, but all we know is he went down on the Kassel mission. So I said, Jesus. I hated to tell him, but I said, look, I got to tell you right now, your son is dead. Jesus, you could have heard a pin drop. I hated to tell him, but what the hell are you going to tell him? You ain't going to tell him he's alive. And I could have said, well, I don't know anything about it or something like that, but I didn't want to do that. So they said, can we come to Michigan to see you? I said, sure. My God, if they didn't come to Michigan during war, it's hard to travel during the war. They came clear to Michigan. He, the Mr. and Mrs. I didn't tell them the details of it. They never did know that he was torn in two or anything, but I said, I can definitely tell you that your son is dead because I was one of the guys that picked his body up. And I said, I hate to tell you that, but they thanked me for telling them because they didn't know. See, well, wasn't only a couple weeks after that, the Red Cross notified him that he was dead. So, you know. But anyway, those people they used to send our kids presents. Oh my God, books and clothes. And they go to Guatemala, they send us presents. And he offered me a job. He owned a factory down in Bell. He wanted me to come to work for him. They had one more son that was still alive. That's all I can tell you about Geisler. That was bad. But there was something about that guy's face that it stuck in my mind, and when I turned him over, that was him, see.